So we're going to look at evangelization, what it is. So if maybe you've heard the word before and you're not exactly sure, or maybe you have heard and you're like, that actually kind of scares me because I know what it's about. So regardless, that's what we're going to kind of focus on tonight. And this word evangelization, we'll get into it a little bit more, but it comes from a word, evangelium, which is the same word as gospel. So when we speak of proclaiming the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the gospel in general is the entire word of God revealing himself to us, is really where this word comes from. So it's going to have something to do with the gospel, the good news. So really, where evangelization is going to begin is it begins with the last thing that Jesus told us to do before he ascended back to heaven. So this is after he goes through his passion, his death, and rises from the dead. Then he appears for a number of days, 40 days, to the different disciples and at different moments. And then he is going to ascend to heaven. And the last thing he tells them, and really he's telling all of us this, because it's not just for the 12 apostles, it's for us all, is go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So this passage in Matthew is known as the Great Commission. It is our mission that we're supposed to go and do. It's what Jesus says, okay, now that I'm going back to heaven, this is what your job is as a Christian. So if we kind of break down into little pieces here, what is Jesus telling us that we're supposed to do? Well, the first thing is an action verb, right? Go! Don't just sit, because that's actually kind of what they did. Immediately after Jesus rises into heaven, they're all like staring up into the sky as he leaves, and the angels actually have to come down and be like, why are you just standing there looking up at the sky? Didn't Jesus just tell you what you're supposed to do? He said go! So that's kind of the first thing, is that we are called to go. We're sent on mission. In fact, if you think back to the very last words that you hear at Mass, go forth. The Mass is ended. So the very end of every Mass that we go to ends the same way that Jesus' earthly life ended. Go. You're sent. In fact, the word mission, in fact, comes from that idea of being sent. In the Latin, originally, the Mass said, ite missa est. Missa, or mission. That's where Mass comes from. So Mass means mission. So we're sent off on mission after Mass. So then we can ask, well, okay, to whom are we supposed to go on mission to? And so he says, make disciples of all nations. So everybody is who we're sent to. Now we'll look at this a little bit more specifically. When it comes to our part of this mission, doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to have to try to somehow go and meet and talk to every single person across the face of the earth. That's not necessarily, but our mission, since we're all supposed to take part of it, we'll see specifically where are the areas that God calls us to mission. So we're supposed to go everywhere. So all peoples is who he wants to send us on mission to. Then he says, what is the mission? So what is it that we're supposed to do? Well, first he says to make disciples. So a disciple is somebody who is a follower of Jesus. So that's ultimately we want to do, is we want to invite people to also become followers of him, to bring other people to come to know God, to come to have a relationship with him. So we'll flesh that out as we go through, but that's fundamentally what our mission is to go and invite others to come and know the Lord. And how are we supposed to do that? Well, through various means. First is baptizing. So sacraments. Baptism is the first sacraments, and we've had classes in here where we've talked about some of the other sacraments. We haven't covered them all probably yet for each of you, but we will through the course of our, over the course of 3 years, we basically cover all the sacraments. So the sacraments are very important as part of growing in a relationship with God. and also into the life of the church. So teaching them all the things that are helpful for following the Lord, bringing us into that family. So, but the question then may be, well, how are we supposed to be able to do something like that? You might think of that. How in the world am I supposed to go to people and help them to become disciples and teach them about things? And well, Jesus says, I am with you always. He doesn't tell us to do it by ourselves. That's an important thing to remember in the background, is that when he asks us not only to be his disciples, but also help others become his disciples, he's not asking us to do that without him. He's going to help us to be able to do it. We can only really do it through his power alone. So, with regard to evangelization, sometimes you might hear in the church something called the new evangelization. Has anybody ever heard of that before? Maybe not. Well, the new evangelization, if you ever hear it, is a recognition that there might be places or people that maybe have historically been exposed to the gospel and maybe have been Christian, but have kind of maybe lost it more recently. And so they're ones who maybe they've heard of Jesus before, but maybe they're not so active and really kind of living it out. And so they need to be told about him again. Their faith has to be kind of built up again. And so that's really what the new evangelization is all about, is that we go to not only the people that have never ever heard of Jesus, period, but even to those who maybe they know about Jesus, but they don't really know him. They don't really have a relationship much with him. Or maybe they have a slightly, but have to continue. Because what we'll see later is that there's many people that can be on various steps along the way of following God. So evangelization is for the new evangelization includes those who maybe they know a little bit in the past about Jesus, but their life of faith with them needs to be renewed. So if you ever hear new evangelization, that's what that means. And that could even include those who actually are baptized Catholic, because there may be Catholics who, I grew up Catholic, but I don't really know what it means or really know what I'm supposed to do about it. I mean, probably could say about myself, there might have been a time in which it really wasn't, I went to Mass and everything, but I didn't really have that much of a relationship with God. So I needed to be evangelized, brought in to help come to know God in a greater way. Sometimes we might think that, well, isn't everybody pretty much around us? If they're not Catholic, they're Christian in some way, so they probably know Jesus already. Well, unfortunately, maybe not quite as much as used to be. And this will show us why there needs to be a new evangelization, because if we look at surveys as to religious affiliation in our place right here, in Antelope and Boone counties, so we just have two counties on here, we can look at the percentage of how many people consider themselves to be Catholic, how many consider themselves in some other religion, and how many consider themselves to have no affiliation to a religion at all. And so if we look back, in 1990, 20 years ago, 36% of the people living in our area consider themselves to be Catholic. 53, just over half, had some kind of religion, and only just over 10% felt themselves as not being involved in any kind of religion at all. But now if we jump ahead, you can see how the unaffiliated, those who don't really feel connected to any kind of faith at all, has really increased since then. So actually, this is 2010, but the most recent data we have is from 2018. Well, if you follow that trend, you can kind of see how it's going. So it's probably upwards around 30% if that trend continues to follow that, which is pretty substantial. That's almost getting to close this, as there's as many people who don't feel connected to any faith as there are Catholics in our area, which means there are people that we can actually go and make disciples of, that we can invite and encourage to meet the Lord in a greater way that maybe don't know. So Sometimes we might think that, well, you have to go travel across the world to some like remote, tribe in the midst of the jungle, and then they're the ones who haven't heard about Jesus, and that's who you evangelize. That's who you tell about Jesus and make disciples of them. Well, the truth is no, actually, many of them are our neighbors, people that we know. So you probably, you know people that maybe don't have much of a connection to any kind of faith. So we'll come back to that. Evangelization, if we want to say it in the easiest way possible, is really everything that we do to tell other people the good news of Jesus Christ. Anything that's involved is part of that. So we'll get into what those things may be. And evangelization really is why we have a church. Why we have a church. In one sense, the church is for those who aren't part of it yet. Obviously, our parishes and our Catholic Church, are for supporting of all of us that are, included as members, that are actively engaged in trying to live out our faith each day. If you weren't doing that to some degree, you wouldn't be here tonight. But in another sense, our church is also for others, those who may not know God. And maybe because they don't know God, they have deep struggles with their life. So what we need to be, Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, is we need to be these: salt and light. We're to be salt and light. So this is actually the gospel for this coming weekend. This is what we'll hear, is the gospel of salt and light. So Jesus uses these two images to help us understand how we're supposed to live in the midst of the world as Christians. So first one is salt. So if you think about it, what do we use salt for? Yeah, we help flavor things, right? That's going to be one of the big reasons. There's other things we use salt for, but that's going to be the primary one that we're going to focus on. Helps flavor. You could say it also helps preserve food when we have it in it. Now, does anyone just eat plain salt? Shouldn't really? No. But when you put salt in there, what does it do to what you put it in? Is it just for the salt flavor? Or is it for, what does it do to what you put it in? Yeah, it brings out what the food actually is doing, right? What the food itself, it enhances the food itself. So when he's saying be salt to the world, that's what we as Christians are supposed to be. We're supposed to be like salt for the world. So we go and we're supposed to flavor the world with Christianity. Flavor it with God's love, not just for ourselves, but to enhance, in a sense, the goodness of the world that God has placed there. That when things are flavored, it doesn't make it into something else necessarily or destroy the uniqueness of individual persons, but it allows their unique flavors that God has already put into them to really shine forth. And that's what it means for us to be salt to the world. Now, in that gospel passage, we'll hear is that Jesus says, but what if salt loses its flavor? What if it doesn't do its job of flavoring the thing you put it in there? Would there be any point of using it at all? No. He says that it's good for nothing. Just throw it on the ground and trample it underfoot. Because it's no different from any other kind of anything like a flavorless rock. Well, he's saying that about us. If we as Christians don't try to flavor the world around us, then what use are we? What makes us different from anybody else? So think about it. Like if we as Christians, if somebody can't really tell we're different from other people in the world, then the church, we become kind of useless to the world. So the church has to be flavorful in a way that's different from the world around us. Otherwise, we become useless. And I think there's been cases in which there's been moments where the church has tried to become more like the world. And that's why people will stop coming to it. Because it's like, well, you don't have a flavor other than what I already have. So what's the point of even being a part of that? So that's going to be our big challenge, to make sure that we're flavorful salt for the world. And then light. we think about the question Jesus says, does anybody light a lamp and then put it under a bushel basket? So you're going to light something and then just cover it up and hide it. Well, that would be kind of silly. Well, that was the whole purpose that you lit it in the first place. You light a light so that you can see everything around it. And light, when you think about it, you don't really spend much time thinking about, like when you're sitting in this room, you're not thinking about the light necessarily that's coming down and helping you to see everything. You think about what you see by the light. So that's the same way for us as Christians, is that we're supposed to also be lights in the world. So in a world that can sometimes be confused and not know what path they are to follow, they kind of wander blindly, trying to figure out what will bring happiness and joy. As lights, Christians, we're supposed to come in and say and help them see there is a path. There is a way. Jesus, he said he is the way. There is a way to lead us to what will truly bring us happiness and joy. But if we hide ourselves under a bushel basket, then once again, Jesus says, well, then we're not living what we're supposed to be. We're not being lights that to help guide those around us. So evangelization is really being light and salt for those around us, to help others come to really be full of flavor and to know the path they are to follow. So it's always going to be an invitation that we put forth, though. So in order to do this, in order to really be salt and light to others, in order to help others come to know God, we can't give to somebody what we don't have ourselves. So that means we have to know him first. So what's very important in order to evangelize and tell others about Jesus is that we have to meet him before we can tell other people. I can say this is the case for me. Prior to going to college, I was Catholic but I was in no state to evangelize anybody because I myself needed some evangelization. I needed to meet Jesus and come to know that he loves me and cares about me before I could tell others that he did that. Because otherwise, for one thing, I wouldn't have been thinking about that. I wouldn't have been convinced that it was worth telling anybody if I myself hadn't met the Lord. And so in our life, it's going to require meeting him, encountering God. That's why we encourage people to pray, because you have so many things that you're busy with, right, that distract us. But we need some of that time, especially time of quiet, to be able to recognize where God's working in our life. It can be a challenge, especially within the life of families, right? Because it feels like there's so many things that we have on our plate. But though the saints tell us that, especially when we're busy, that's when we need to pray the most. But being able to meet the Lord ourselves is really that's the only way we're going to be able to share the Lord with others. For myself, a really big way when I was in college, it was first the witness of other Christians that I was there with college. They helped me to meet God because of the way they lived it out. They, in a sense, evangelized me. They weren't even Catholic. Most of them were kind of like non-denominational Christian. But because of the great joy that they had in living out their faith, they evangelized me in a big way. And then also, I started going and praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament. So in front of our Lord in the Eucharist, and it kind of started like, oh, Jesus, is that really you? If it's you, help me to know you. Also, part of it too was, help me to understand what am I supposed to do with my life. Because up to that point, it was always about, it was all about, what do I want to do? But then I started asking, well, God, what do you really want me to do? And so it's because I myself encountered God, that I came to know him in a greater way, that I'm your priest today. That's the reason why, I was moved to want to help you also encounter God in a greater way. but it took some time, right? It didn't happen for me overnight. So if it sounds kind of like, well, that's intimidating, I don't know if I've met God enough to be able to tell other people about him yet. Because one of the important things is, like, once we meet God, how do we tell people about him? How do we tell the evangelium, the good news? And there's many different ways in which we can think through it. This is one way, but it's good for each of us to really ponder, how would I explain what it means to be a follower of Jesus? What is the good news that he did for us? And this is really kind of the short synopsis of it, right? So it starts with relationship. That God loves us. He created us. He made us for relationship with himself. But unfortunately, ruin came into the picture. We turned away from him. We try to find happiness and fulfillment in so many other things other than God. We say no to him. Praise God, though, he wanted to restore us. So this is the whole reason why he sent Jesus to come among us, to be able to restore us to relationship with him. That he would die on the cross, rise again to forgive the sins, and bring us back into relationship with him. And so now we have this opportunity to respond. How am I going to live my life? Am I going to try to be, am I going to want to be in relationship with him, since he's invited me into this relationship? Or am I going to remain in a state maybe that maybe sometimes feels easier, but probably ends up to not being as happy as we could be? So this is one way of describing it. It's not the only way we can describe it, but that's one of, I think, our challenges is how, for each of you, how would I describe what God has done? Well, because this is going to be an important thing when we evangelize. We have to, we're basically going to be speaking individually, or sharing our life with somebody else. And so we have to be kind of authentic, right? You don't want to just come and repeat something that, like, well, this is how Father Vogel said it, so this must be the way to do it. It's going to be unique and individual to every person. Pope Francis, one of the first things that he wrote when he became Pope was called The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. And he said in there that in your heart, the reason why we would go and evangelize, even if it's difficult to talk to other people about our faith, in your heart you know that it is not the same to live without him. That you've come to realize what has helped you to live and given you hope is what you also need to communicate to others. It says the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of those who encounter Jesus. And like for myself, that's why I'm a priest today. Like falling in love with Jesus, especially in the Eucharist, and coming to believe that that's actually truly his real presence there in communion when we go to Mass. That's what has motivated me to say yes to God and becoming a priest for him. It's not the easiest thing in the world some days. Similar kind of thing for you in your married and vocation as parents. You can probably attest that not every single moment is always going to be easy. But you've discovered some kind of love or joy in the midst of that motivates you to live that out, even if it's not always easy at every moment. And so that's the same way. If we meet Jesus, when we truly come to know his love for us, then that will motivate us to do that. Especially for, in your case, I think the first people that you're called to share the gospel with, that you're called to share your relationship with God, are your children. You help each other as spouses, but also your children. You're the first place they're going to learn about his love. And so the more deeply you know him, not just about him, but you really know his care for you, the better they're going to be able to learn that as well. And just to give you a little bit of insight, that's kind of the whole reason why we have family formation the way that it is. It's why we have you guys come down here and have me teach you, because your children will so much easier come to know God if we help you also first come to know God. That way you can then pass on how you've met him to them. And that's the most effective way of being able to help them grow in faith. So that's kind of why we do it this way. So the question might be, how do I evangelize? Sometimes when people hear the word evangelizing, like having to go and talk to people about the faith, they're like, so does that mean we have to go be like Mormon missionaries and like go door to door and be like, have you heard of Jesus? No. I don't know. Has anybody ever had any missionaries come to the door out here? No, not Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, yeah. So there's an example. I can remember there would be occasional ones where they would come to my parents' farm. So I know some of them come out to the country. Very dedicated. It's inspiring to see how dedicated they are and wanting to share their faith. I remember when I was in college, I got into several conversations with the Mormons, especially, and so that was real fun. There was one where I was already a deacon. I was ordained a deacon, and I was at visiting my sister in Lincoln, and a couple of them come walking up, and they start talking to me, and they had their like talking points, and of course like my response wasn't the response they were looking for, like that they had been trained. Well, when they say this, then you say this. Like, so I didn't lead them on for long. So I was like, I'm a Catholic deacon in the church. I'd love to spend time talking to you, but I knew my sister really didn't want to at that point. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to do that. So as Catholics, actually, most Catholics aren't really called to do that. Now, there are actually some ministries within the Catholic Church that do something like that. So there's some groups called like the St. Paul Street Evangelization. So they actually go out and they will set up maybe something on the street and are just there for if people want to talk. Legion of Mary is another group where they'll actually do home visits, and they'll actually go and they go and they meet the people there, and to see if there's any needs, but also to be if there might be an opportunity to share something of our Lord with them as well. Now, not everybody is going to be called to that, and so don't be concerned if you're like, oh, so that's what you mean by evangelization. Well, I don't want to do that. I'm not about to go and knock on every door in Elgin and and say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. To tell you the truth, I'd be afraid to do that too. But evangelization follows, we can look to the Bible to see what's the method that Jesus used. So the method that Jesus used, we could say, is something called spiritual multiplication. So what we see in the Gospels, we have Jesus. He's the one who comes, and he wants to bring everybody to his Father. And he chooses 3 individuals, Peter, James, and John, to be his closest companions, right? So normally we think probably about the 12 apostles, right? But if you listen closely in the Gospels, Peter, James, and John are there for some of the closest moments with Jesus. So he really, even though he's ministering to the 12, he's especially ministering to those 3. And so what this teaches us is that when it comes to evangelization, we're not necessarily called to try to engage in some kind of deep spiritual relationship with like a whole bunch of random people. But that who might be certain individuals that are already in my life. Maybe they're in family, extended family. Maybe they're at work. Maybe they're, somebody that I happen to see. Maybe it's, somebody that I go to for a service, But these are people that are already there at one spot in my life that I already interact with in some way. Maybe there's certain individuals that God's calling me to really take a deeper interest in their life. Just like Jesus took in those 3. Now, Jesus ministers to the 3, and then further, those 3 are able to minister to the 12. And then there's a point in the scripture where then there's the 72. So the 12 then expands to 72 disciples. And then, of course, in the early church, it expands even further. So this is a kind of spiritual multiplication where on each level it's kind of multiplying the numbers. So here's another way of showing it. So Paul, another great example of a great evangelist, he had certain disciples that he worked very closely with. So for example, Timothy, Titus, Epaphras are some of the early disciples that he worked closely with. So in one of his letters to Timothy, he says to Timothy, "What you heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful people who will be able to teach others also." So what he's saying to Timothy is, so you've learned this from me, now it's time for you to go do the same, right? So I've been helping you be formed as a disciple following Jesus. Now it's your turn to go and help some other people to do that. And then hopefully those other people that you do, they too will then also learn how to form disciples. And then that generation of disciples will then learn how to form the next generation of disciples. And as you see, it's going to continue to expand out, right? More and more in each generation, if the previous generation is choosing 2 or 3 people that they're going to help bring and take a real interest in their life and help them come to know the Lord. In fact, this is much more effective than if, let's say, you said, well, in the church, the priests are probably the best ones to do this, right? So let's just have the priests do it. And so they're kind of like, maybe like, we'll call them super apostles. They're really good at it. And maybe a priest can, he can really convert like 10,000 people. Whereas like, I can't do that many. And so let's say in theory, if you had a super evangelist versus the regular person, like all of us, myself and you, if you had a super evangelist, and every year the super evangelist could bring 10,000 people to God. That's how good they are. Well, after 2 years, you have 20,000 people that are now know the Lord. After 3 years, 30,000, and so forth. After 14 years, you have 140,000. Sounds, wow, that was pretty effective. But what about spiritual multiplication? Well, if you start with that one person, and that one person is going to invest deeply in 3 people. Now we got 4 people. Doesn't look all that impressive, right? But then let's say the next year, those people that have been invested in, they're now ready to share their encounter with God with the next generation. So now suddenly you got 13. So then the 4th year, if each of those then also have 3 people, now you got 40. So as you keep going down, suddenly after 14 years, the super evangelist was only able to lead 140,000 people. But through spiritual multiplication, by passing on the faith to the next generation of people that will then share the faith with not 10,000 people, but with only 3. Each individual person only has to evangelize 3 people. Then suddenly you've got more than every single person throughout the entire who lives in the entire archdiocese of Omaha could be evangelized. That's how powerful spiritual multiplication is. And that's why if we look into the scriptures, that's why in the early church, over those first number of years, that's why the Christianity spread throughout the entire known world. Not because there were super evangelists, but because normal people of faith were sharing it with just the people that they happened to meet around them. So this brings me a lot of hope because like sometimes as a priest I think of like, so my personality personally is very introverted, and like I am not a super apostle. Like I'm not so extroverted that I could talk to like the random person and be like, hey, Jesus. And like it's really hard for me to do something like that. But hearing this, no, actually you just need to invest in a certain number, a smaller group of people, and help them also become apostles. And then they're going to share it with the next people. And then suddenly that's the way Jesus is going to reach so many people. That brings so much more hope. It feels like it's actually doable, right? So hopefully that would be the same way for you. It's like, okay, so evangelization doesn't mean I have to go door to door. It doesn't mean I have to try to talk to like, thousands of strangers about Jesus. All it means is there might be a few people in my life that, maybe I need to really pay attention to them. And at certain moments, interject things of the faith. Now that's kind of the next part. Well, how do we do this without it being like fake, right? Because it doesn't mean that you have to be like, so there's that person, that's the one I want to evangelize. Call them up, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. Well, that's probably not how you're going to start in the evangelization process. So, well, first to think about who it is that God would be calling me to help lead to the Lord. Well, as parents, you know that your children are part of that, for sure. But there's also other people around us that you may as well. One of the things to think about is that like evangelizes like. So what I mean by that is that if you have some kind of connection or some kind of similarity with somebody already, that's often the best person that you'll be able to talk to about things of the faith. So, give you an example. When I was in college, one of the summers I was on, and this was kind of towards the end of my time in college, after I kind of started really getting more, living out my faith a lot more. So I was on a physics research program this summer before my senior year. And there was one of my friends that I got to know on that. She kind of grew up kind of nominally Christian, but she really didn't practice it anymore. And so because we had this common interest of physics that we were both working on that summer, she also, come to know, and through just normal conversations, she also had something of an interest in learning more about God. She wasn't exactly sure everything about that she thought about it, but we ended up having really interesting conversations through the course of that summer about faith, because we had that common connection that kind of gave us this kind of inroad to be able to talk about the faith. So it was really so that's what we mean by like evangelizing like. So, who is the best person to evangelize a farmer? A farmer. Who is the best person to evangelize a teacher? A teacher. Who is the best person to evangelize a mother? Maybe another mother, right? So to think about, those kind of connections with others that we have, that because part of it is that there has to be a kind of level of trust, right, that you have built in a relationship with somebody else if they're really going to listen to something like that. They really know that you care about them and there's that connection there. So that's what I mean by like evangelizing like. One of the I don't know if you've ever seen this quote: "Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words." This is a quote that sometimes is attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, and sometimes people will use that and say, "Yeah, see, I'm evangelizing by the way I live." And he says, "If necessary, use words." So my life just shows my faith. Like, wow, you must really be a living saint then, if everything you do shows forth faith that clearly. The problem with even if Francis said that, which there's actually no evidence that he actually said that, he actually found it quite necessary to use words all the time. So there's no if there. He would say, yes, it is often necessary to use words. In fact, like the images that you often see of St. Francis, they'll be like, oh, St. Francis, he was all about animals and he loved animals. Well, what he's doing here is actually there was no people around for him to preach the gospel to. So he's preaching to the animals. He's preaching to the birds. So he felt it was so necessary to preach the gospel and use words that he did it even if there wasn't any human beings around. So there will be times in which we're going to start a kind of evangelization with people not using words, but just being ourselves and building up kind of a relationship with them before we start talking about things. But then there will be a point where it's necessary to use words, because I don't think, at least not for myself, most of us are not so great of saints that everybody looking on the outside of us will automatically be able to interpret everything we do as automatically leading them to God. Like, Be kind of nice if you're that good of a saint, but probably not. um, so what we need to do first is, I already mentioned that in order to be able to share Jesus with others, we first have to encounter Jesus. We first have to encounter God. But then in order to share him with somebody else, we then have to encounter them. We have to really meet that person and come to know them. And this can be a challenge. I mean, I have to admit myself, because since I'm more introverted, I'm not always good at this. I mean, I have to say that, like, even when it comes to the parish, I wish I were better at being able to encounter all of you and be able to, get to know you better and, like, know the things that are on everybody's hearts, to be able to help you more in whatever the things are that you struggle with. And sometimes people will help me with that and share the things with me, and that's great, because I'm not always very good at asking about it all the time. So that's one of the. So if you feel like maybe that's part of your own personality, not to be too distressed. It's something that as priests we all have limitations, but we're also all called to kind of push a little bit more out into what might be kind of uncomfortable for us. So what I'm going to show you here, there's a lot of stuff here, so we won't cover everything. What this kind of is it's called the thresholds of conversion, but it's to help us think about, like, when we meet somebody, where not everybody that we meet is going to be in the same place in a relationship with God. There might be some that are super on fire for God, and others that maybe not even sure if God even exists. And so when we talk to people, especially if we want to share something about our faith with them, we kind of have to know them first. We kind of have to know, where might they be? So if we kind of look a little bit, this is kind of a description of where people could be in their faith life. So you could start all the way, maybe somebody is in the area of pre-trust. So maybe if you mention anything about being Catholic, they might be like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Maybe they even had a bad experience of something having to do with the Catholic Church in the past. They have no trust whatsoever in what Christianity or the Catholic Church is. So if you were to mention something about it to them, they're probably going to be put off right away. And that won't be a very effective way to try to help them come to know God. So if somebody is in that area, you're probably not going to start off with, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. That would be very ineffective. Instead, it might simply be beginning to try to form a friendship with them. And sometimes it might be really, or it might simply be that kind of, like, maybe it's somebody that you work with. So it's kind of built into the way you have to work, is that I have to form some kind of relationship with this person because they're one that I normally interact with. And so it might take a long time before you might be ready to actually say something explicitly about the faith. Maybe somebody is in the place of trust, where maybe they have some kind of positive association with Christianity, with God, with the church. So there is a kind of trust there, but they're not really actively involved in living out any kind of faith life. Now, it might be a little bit easier to talk about the faith with that person than the first one, but there's still maybe more that needs to be developed before you can get into certain kinds of conversations. Things like curiosity. So maybe they're interested in learning more about the faith, but they're not quite ready to actually change the way they live in following God. All the way to, like, somebody maybe is seeking. They're ready, and they're actually looking for, and maybe they're actually like, hey, you're Catholic, aren't you? Well, what about this? And they're actually truly wanting to know. That's, of course, different from maybe the curiosity ones who might be like, hey, so I saw this on the news about this was happening with the Pope. What's that all about? So thinking about, well, where might this person be? Are they further towards the not quite even trusting, or are they further along to maybe actually even, seeking out? They're interested in maybe even becoming Christian, becoming Catholic. Right in the middle of this is kind of the decision point. This is where they've learned enough about Christianity, about the church, about Jesus, that they want to make a firm decision to actually start living and following the Lord. So that's a place where people can then get to. Then following that, there's those that are just starting to live and be disciples. Those that are growing as disciples. Maybe they're like, well, I know it's important. I'm focused on myself, and I want to grow personally in relationship with God. And then they could go all the way to the place commissioned disciple, where, all right, now that I know God, I am ready to go and tell others about it. All the way to the very end, where it says a spiritual multiplier is somebody who's, I know God so well to the point that I want to help others to become a disciple that can then pass on the faith to somebody else. So any person that we meet, we could think about, well, where might they be in this kind of path in relationship with God? So if there's a specific person, you're like, this person might be somebody that maybe God would want me to really care about more. This could be a potential person that maybe God wants to be his disciple. Well, where is this person at? Is this person still kind of in the pre-trust stage where, well, maybe what I need to do is maybe invite them to certain, maybe it's like some kind of social function or something that doesn't have anything to do with faith, because they wouldn't be ready for that. Or maybe they're kind of, curious. And you're like, well, hey, if you're curious about it, maybe check out this article that I found. And then we can talk about it afterwards. That's the important thing, is like, evangelization is not, it's that personal relationship. So it's just giving people stuff is not the most effective. But if you give them something, then you're like, well, let's talk about that then. It's that personal interaction that's much more effective. Because our faith is all about relationship. Or maybe it's somebody like, well, actually, maybe they're already committed in following the Lord, but maybe we can move them along a little bit further, and maybe they don't realize, like, oh, you mean I could also help people to follow the Lord? I could help make them become disciples too? Yeah, I want to do that. So it's not a cut and dry thing. Like, you don't have to be like, well, I know that person is definitely on that part right there. It may not be so easy to place people exactly, and it's not a scientific thing. But it can be helpful to think in those terms, that the way that we talk to people and try to share the faith will depend upon where they're at. All right. So through all of that, we want to make sure that this is true for wherever somebody is, but it's especially true for those that are more towards the, maybe not quite trusting yet, is that we show that we truly care about their needs, right? Evangelization is not about like, well, I'm going to be a great evangelizer, and I'm going to make sure this many people come to get to know Jesus, but you don't actually care about them. You just care about your quota, in a sense, right? That's not a good way of going about it. We need to care about what's people's needs. And what we'll find is that that's really when people will be open to God, is when they realize that his followers actually do care about their specific needs. Pope Francis, in one way of talking about it, he said that the church needs to be like a field hospital on the battlefield. Is that there are people out there that are hurting through various ways. I mean, I have to say probably one of the things that's kind of been on my mind more recently is it seems like there's so many that struggle with depression and just being down on things, and just I don't know, this kind of darkness that kind of over encompasses people, and like that's really been on my heart, is like I want to be able to help people like that, and there's sometimes it feels like I don't know exactly how to do it. So like, I have this book on depression from like a Catholic psychiatrist, and I'm like, I need to sit down and read this, because I want to understand more how can I help people. But those are the kinds of things we need to, if there's ways in which people are hurting, that the Lord wants to come and meet them there, and he wants to heal them. Just as we saw, I didn't talk about tonight's gospel earlier in the homily, but that's one of the things Jesus does, right? He comes and he's healing people, not only of physical illnesses, but most importantly, the illnesses of the soul, the um, what's going on within us. So that's what we want. We're kind of like, a field hospital, caring for those around us. And as I mentioned earlier, that, we exist in a lot of ways for our non-members. That we're not just here for ourselves, but that we're really here to invite others to come in. So that is our commission that Jesus gives to us, to go and make disciples of all nations. Obviously, individually, we don't have to do it for everybody, but the more all of us find those individuals within our circle of relationships, then the more that will actually happen. To think that Jesus entrusts to us so much, he really believes that we can all do it. That he's not going to do it. He doesn't act as the super apostle. Instead, he calls us all to be spiritual multipliers. You might still say, I don't know if I can do it. I'm not really good at sharing the faith. Or maybe I'm not really good at thinking about what other people need.